Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are page 1255. So I'm going to do a short summary of Ayin Beis from the beginning till where we are, which I do from time to time. It could be helpful to put things into context. So as you know, Ayin Beis began being delivered by the Rebbe Rashab in 1912, Shavuos, Tafresh Ayin Beis. We actually began learning it 2012, which is 100 years later, a little earlier than that. So we're now almost 10 years into it. Now we know that the Rebbe Rashab wrote the Hemshech before he began to deliver it. So it was written, he was always ahead in writing, and then he delivered it week after week with many different breaks. This went on from 1912 to 1915. In the beginning of the end of 1915, around October, the Rebbe Rashab stopped delivering the Hemshech. That covers the first two volumes as we've been learning them, not the new edition, the first two volumes. The third volume that we're learning now was only written, never delivered. It was so after he left Lubavitch, he never said any longer in the spoken word the Maimor. Now the central theme, as you know, I use the word interface. This Tuesday is also the Rebbe Rashab's birthday, 161st birthday. He was born Chav Cheshvan Tafresh Chav Aleph, so it would be the year would be 19 Tafresh Chav, like 1860, in October 1860 approximately. So the Rebbe Rashab interface, that's the one word I use, even though it's the central theme of all of Torah and Chassidus and Kabbalah and Chassidus, but you see it come alive in Ayin Beis in the most powerful way, because he really covers every aspect of this interface between what? Between God and existence, between the transcendent and the immanent, you can say between body and soul, between a higher reality and our defined reality. And this interface, in one word in Kabbalah, is used the word keser, which becomes the recurring and constant word. Keser is used many, many times throughout the Hemshech. Right at the beginning of the Hemshech, B'shar shekdimu Yisrael nasel nishma. And when the Jews proceeded saying, first we will do, then we will hear, God, they woe for them. 3 crowns, Ksarim. And he talks about the 3 crowns, the 3 levels in Keser, ultimately. 3 meanings in Keser, but 3 levels. But Keser in general is a crown. It's above. A crown is not part of the human body. It's a head. It's on top of the body. In the spiritual sense, Keser is Ratzon of God, but also Keser has in it all elements of transcendence, a transcendence that relates to existence, a transcendence on its own, and a transcendence that's completely beyond. And to build that case in 3 levels in Keser, the Rebbe Rashab goes into a whole discussion of the immanent energy. If Keser is the Ratzon, a makif, that so-called, it transcends what makes existence tick. What is the very DNA and the building blocks of existence? And that's what we call the 10 spheres, the Esser spheres, the 10 spheres. From Chochmah through Malchus, Chochmah Bina Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. So it becomes a long discussion for around 50, a good 50 chapters, about immanent energy, defining what are these Esser spheres, the instruments, the building blocks, the divine attributes that God uses to create existence, structure. And he uses clearly that analogy. A human being has actual faculties like seeing, hearing, intelligence, emotions, and then they have Keser, is our transcendent faculties, like Ratzon, our desire or pleasure. And he discusses there too 3 levels in spheres, coming from the word sphera, as in from the word counting. Sphere has the word story, sipur, telling a narrative, and also has the word sapir, which means a sapphire stone, illuminating, transparent. So the three immanent levels correspond to the three transcendent levels, and he discusses them all on the highest levels all the way to before the Tzimtzum, how before the Tzimtzum God already envisioned the structure of existence as well as the transcendent states. Okay. After discussing that, there comes a next section is a whole piece about the difference between the bli gvul and gvul, the era bli gvul and era gvul, which is the transcendent energy and the immanent energy, how they unite with each other, how one reflects the work of the Ovis, the patriarchs. They reconnected existence back to its original source of where God envisioned it. We call it the Er HaGvul, and Torah introducing a Er Chadash, a completely unprecedented new energy into existence. And that goes on for a while, where it discusses on so many different levels and talks about the interface of the different realities that help us understand how you join these two together. Torah is an interface, Ak is an interface, Atzilus is an interface, Chachma is an interface, Bina explains interface on many, many different levels, and ultimately leads us to the verse in Yeshaya where he talks about Arimimcha, not Arimimcha Lekaya Melech, that's later, another pasuk with the word Arimimcha in it, where he talks about how you bring Reimamus, which is transcendence, into existence. And there's a long discussion on the concept of Moichus Tima, Chachmas Tima, the two levels of Chachmas Tima in Keser. One is a superconscious that relates to the conscious, and one is a superconscious completely beyond the conscious, that is always remains beyond us, and how they two work with each other and ultimately explain the interface of Keser. And that leads us to a Chachma and Keser connecting, Aleph and Pella, that the word Aleph is Chachma. Chachma teaches Bina, that's Aleph Beis, Aleph Bina. But then there's Aleph, the words Pella, wonder, which again refers to Keser. Two different ways we understand the relationship between Chachma and Keser. Aleph is a keli for Pella, or Aleph itself is the word Pella. That goes into a whole discussion of the Shem Ma, which is Aleph. The Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, when it's in the Milui, when it's in its permutation called Aleph, the Hey Aleph, and everything is with an Aleph, that is the level of Shem Ma Bittul, the discussion of how Bittul is critical in this interface, and Bittul is Shem Ma, the Bittul of Atzilus, and its alter ego, or its antithesis, is the world of Toyu, where there is no Bittul. So you have a lot of energy and a lot of transcendence, but it doesn't have balance and harmony. And that leads into the next section where he talks a lot about the Metzach, of the connection of things that are the very highest levels in the Shtalshalos that come down, and the way they can experience interface. And the end of volume 1 concludes with Hashem Arimimcha Lekaya Melech, which again, Lekaya Melech refers to the divine within existence. Arimimcha is the divine that transcends existence. And Arimimcha Lekaya Melech means bringing them both together, and there are two ways. Either Mamayla Lamata, which is like through Torah, Arimimcha Keser Reimamus is brought down into the immanent, Lekaya Melech, Malchus, and the Koiches, into the immanent divine as it manifests within existence, like basically bli gvul into gvul, and or mamata lamayla through davening tefillah, which is arimimcha lekaya melech. You're elevating a lekaya melech to the level of reimamus. To explain that, he explains lekaya koyach, arimimcha lekaya melech, the four different or five different relationships between etzem and ispashtus, koyach and poel, yesh ma'ayin and gili ahelim, and also hiyuli and gili, which is different relationships between the divine and existence that are closer or more distant. And then that leads into the next discussion of Malchus as Koyach, that on one hand it's removed, on the other hand it connects to existence. And then he goes into the long parentheses that we're actually in the middle of still, which is the Torah of the Magid of Asela Chashtei Chatzetzres, Chatzitzuris. Chatzitzuris is two halves. Again, the story of interface, uniting the two halves, the divine and the human being. And how the Torah of the Magid, he slowly develops it and explains it. Literally, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of pages of how you bring those two together. The Chatzitzuris, that God creates all the different tzimtzumim, concealments, and our job is to retrace the steps and connect. But then comes the question, fine, we can connect Atzilus to, you can connect the immanent divine immanence in Atzilus, which is the 10 spheres and the structure, to that which is higher, to Keser and the Rememus. But how do you connect it with Biyah, which is a world that comes after the Parsa, after concealment and partitions? So how do you bring a divine state into a concealed state? It's one thing to bring it into a place that, okay, the divine infinite is now connecting with the divine as it manifests in the finite. But now you're dealing with forces that are concealing the divine. Tzimtzum and Parsa, where you don't even feel godliness in the fullest sense. How can you create an interface with a level like that? And that becomes a new discussion here on the whole length of Parsoyas. What is the role of the Parsoyas? These are the partitions that exist within Shtalshus. Till now, the Rebbe Rashab was talking about Bligvul and Gvul, Spheris, Eris, Kalim, Bittel, and so on. Now he goes beyond Kalim. Kalim and Eris and Kalim, okay, we need to understand how they unite ultimately. So that's been discussed in the first, basically volume and a half of Ayin Beis. In the second half of let's say the second, after a third, maybe this 1/3 into the second volume, begins a discussion. How does that now manifest in a reality that's post-Tzimtzum and post-Parsa, really? Because post-Tzimtzum, they're all post-Tzimtzum, but how do you contend with the concealment? And here goes a whole series of discussion, which actually leads to where we are now. But briefly, the summary of this next section is that you can't bypass the Tzimtzum, because that is not the purpose. We want existence as is defined, its identity after a Tzimtzum. You can't override the Tzimtzum, and you can't surrender to the Tzimtzum. So what you have to do, he says, the only way out is through transforming the Tzimtzum. So this becomes a long discussion. What is Tzimtzum? Tzimtzum is not an end in itself. It's only a stepping stone, a means to bring deeper revelation. So the Tzimtzum really is B'shvil HaGilui, and the Gilui, even before the Tzimtzum, is also in order to go through the Tzimtzum and be received by the recipients, which is us. So ultimately, the interface, the goal of the interface is not just to reach a world of godliness like Atzilus, but to reach a world where things are concealed, and the concealment itself is a stepping stone to higher revelation. And that is the transformation of the Tzimtzum, or the transformation of the animal soul within us. So not only do we bring light there, but we transform. Now, in this transformation, he enters now the next step, which is the second part. This maybe this is now the 2/3 into the second volume. The Shvus Maimor v'yadaita hayom v'shavesa levavecha ki Hashem hu Elokim b'shamayim emal v'aretz mitochas einoid. Explaining that, and this is all, mind you, in the parentheses that is discussing through davening, through tefillah, the interface. So now comes this verse, and this verse captures this whole theme. V'yadaita hayom means that we, through our mind, Chochmah Bina Das, all the way to Das, is Kashrus, bond and connect intimately, and it brings it into our emotions. What? Ki Havaya hu Elokim, that Havaya, the transcendent, hu Elokim, is one with Elokim. B'shamayim emal, in the higher worlds, the transcendent worlds, and ma'aretz mitachas, in the imminent. And then Einoid, we'll get to, is the last part of the verse, but first he speaks about that. The Yichud of Havaya Elokim, Mamayla Lamata, Mamata Lamayla. Again, interface. And that leads into the whole discussion of Havaya Elokim. What is Hayom, Yom and Laila, Tzimtzum and Ur, Rotzeh and Shuv, Shabbos and the weekdays. Connect, all interfacing, Das Elyon and Das Tachten. That the 3 meals of Shabbos also are comparable and to the 3 levels within what we've been discussing. One level that's imminent, one level that is transcendent, and one level of transcendence that relates to existence, the lowest level of Shabbos, Friday night, transcendence as an entity of its own, and then transcendence, Atik Yomen, or Raiva Deraivan, completely beyond. Generally, it's 2 levels, Das Elyon and Das Tachten. Man, Lechem in Hashemayim, and Lechem in Haaretz. Lechem in Haaretz gives us a taste of discovering God within through bread, the bread we eat. Lechem in Hashemayim gives us a taste of God that's beyond existence, coming from the heavenly bread that doesn't come through our efforts, and also is not digestible. It doesn't have any pseulus, doesn't have any waste. So Shabbos has a level. We know Shabbos is a day where there's no birudim. We're not supposed to be separating things, even halachically, but also spiritually. But then he says there's the birur of Shabbos. There's a level of beyond Birurim of the weekdays, where there's the work with the negative energies and all the negative forces that we have to extract and clarify and separate and elevate. Then the Shabbos, that Birur is Eichel Metoich Eichel, it's only in Kedusha itself. And then there's a level of Shabbos that's completely beyond Birurim, that highest transcendent level. So from Das Elyon, Das Tachton comes the end of volume 2, where he concludes with the whole discussion of everything divides into Yesh, Ayin, and Yesh. And the Ayin breaks into two parts. Yesh Amiti is Atzmus, Yesh Nivri is the created reality, and the Ayin Beis is Oyer, that divides into two, the Ayin that represents the divine, the Ayin that represents existence, and then talks about how they all ultimately unite, and all the different ways we interpret those levels of Ayin. Before the Tzimtzum, before the Tzimtzum, and after the Tzimtzum, and after the Tzimtzum, and the goal is ultimately to unite them. And with that, he more or less concludes, then he goes back to V'daita Yem V'Shavesa Levach Ki Hashem Olekim. The B'Shamayim Mimal V'La'oretz Metochas, what does that come to teach us? That it comes to teach us that it's all one reality. And also comes to teach us that even in Oretz Metochas, also in Das Tachten, you come to experience Das Elyon. So again, interface. That is more or less the conclusion of volume 2. And then comes volume 3. Volume 3 starts Ein Oid. So what's Ein Oid? So it says, till now we've been learning Havaya Elakim, it's all within the Oir, is manifesting also the highest levels of divine transcendence are manifesting in Elokai HaMelech in the lowest levels. But we didn't talk about the very darkness itself. We said Simson B'Shvil Agili. Yes, but what happens with the very concealment itself, with the very Yesh itself? And this volume concerns itself with that we're going to transform the darkness itself, that the darkness itself is transformed. Elokim itself is going to be a divine energy, not just as a keli and a container that reveals Havaya. Elokim itself becomes elevated and even higher than Havaya, which is why we're learning about Malchus rising to such high levels. It's far from finished, this subject, but this is where he goes into now. The ultimate, the final step is that existence itself is very concealment, it's very yeshus, will also be elevated. Like the moon will become greater than the sun, like we spoke about in the beginning. But he just began the points, spoke about it, how Malchus becomes higher than Zah, and that is like Elokim itself is going to be higher, be Mashpia. And that is where he sets the stage. And to explain that, he goes to Havaya Yechatem Merivov, where God is destroys his enemies, and which is obviously talking about these levels as well, these dark levels. And that led us into the next step, which is Gan Eden and Olam Haba. Now, at the outset, it's not clear what the flow is, but as we're going to learn it, you're going to see that Gan Eden and Olam Haba and Gan Eden, before Aved and after Aved, is all going to be a manifestation of this interface, of how we ultimately, through our work, can actually draw new energy after the steps before that. So really, Gan Eden is going to be a sense of like almost like an expression of this whole interface work. So now went into a whole discussion, Gan Eden, what's the difference between Gan Eden and the rest of the worlds, and what's the difference between Gan Eden when it's created, and the Gan Eden Vayinecheu, after Adam and Chava, La'avdil Shama, after we do work, how does that change Gan Eden? So now he explained that Gan Eden is actually bringing Atzilus into Biyah, into Bria. And that was the question that remained hanging as well. How does Atzilus go into Bria? Very similar to the question of volume 2. How do you bring the divine that's higher after the parsa, the partition, into Bria? So Gan Eden is a good example of the interface, because Gan Eden is bringing higher energy into a lower level, into Biyah, into Bria. And to explain that, the Rebbe Rashab went into Mutfa, Murgish, and Muska. That there's Primis HaMalchus and Chitzenius HaMalchus, there's Primis Zah, Chitzenius Zah, and generally 3 levels of emotional growth and development. First, as subjective creatures, that we are just natural, behavioral, reflexive. In other words, that's basically, if you want to talk about interface, that's how we begin our lives as children. But you want to grow. And as you grow, the midas are essentially not transcendent. Midas are by definition subjective and about your reality, your self-interest. So the midas grow, the mind grows, the cognitive begins to introduce new dimensions, but it's still all commensurate to the emotional development to the emotional wiring and the natural hatfa, the natural wiring of a person. You move from mutvid to murgish. In murgish itself, it's emotions, but it's still your natural emotions, but they grow. And there's a murgish mitzad aseichel. Bina continues to tend to her offspring, which are the emotions. In other words, all within the structure of existence. And then comes a stage where you reach chachma, and chachma is able to introduce something beyond existence, the transcendent, because chachma connects with keser, and that introduces into the person a reality beyond their own subjective self-interest, to the point that the emotions too mature and they catapult bina to stand side by side with chachma, the yichud pnimi of Abba ve'ima, father and mother, chachma and bina, as they gaze at what? Again, keser, as they gaze at arich, as the forehead of arich, and which draws down the 370, the shinayin, the 370 energies of atik, but it takes it all the way back to the root of it all, which is the sherish, all the way to atzmos ein sof. And this in turn also elevates the emotion. Zah becomes like Abba, godless Abba, and Malchus too elevates from Biti, the daughter, to Achesi, the sister, equal to Zah and to Teda, to Imi, the mother, that's Mashpia and Teda, and ultimately the mother, as it elevates to the highest levels, like the Neshamas that are higher than Teda and are Mashpia into Teda, and the Neshamas using Teda, and they both work with each other, ultimately lead us everything back to Atzmos Ein Sof that's higher than Teda, where Tshuva is the deepest roots of Atzmos Ein Sof that's higher than all structure. Teda is still connected to the structure. And ultimately, it's the neshamas that lead the person. But this is predicated on one thing, Aveda. We can't do this. It doesn't happen on its own. The Aveda of a person, to the point of B'chol Avavcha, but mostly Mechol Meidecha, Mesiras Nefesh, where it becomes all-consuming, completely all-consuming love to God, where there's nothing else, Mesiras Haratzon, completely. So when you draw from that core place that's beyond your structure, beyond your natural midas, meaning your natural wiring, so that in turn draws down beyond God's natural structure, so to speak, all the way to the highest levels of Atzmos Ein Sof, Er Chodosh, an unprecedented energy that permeates everything. Chachma, Bina, Zah, and Malchus, all in this one all-consuming connection to the divine, the highest levels of the divine. And that's where we reached on page 1255. So if you see it, you see this one long, big flow. Obviously, I just summed up 1,255 pages, so it's not exactly all the details covered. There's much, much more. But as far as I can say, Roshei Prakim, which means main headlines and main like chapter structure or main thematic structure, this is more or less the flow. And it all obviously ties into each other. What has not been concluded yet is a much more discussion about exactly what happens in Gan Eden, and ultimately Einoid, to get back to Einoid, of how we transform the very substance of the concealment and existence itself, the Yesh itself. So there you have it.
Wow. That was unbelievable. Thank you. That was just a brilliant summary. I've never seen someone summarize 1,250 pages in 10 minutes.
Was it 10 minutes? Okay.
Maybe 7 or 8. Shkar. Unbelievable.
Okay. Well, I have to show something for 10 years of learning, no?
For sure. But to put it out of your mouth is a different story. Thank you. Anybody joining your class should listen to that first.
Yeah. So if you want to go back to the first page of this third volume, you see right away, after he sums up Havaya Elikim, he says, Ach mashakosav einoid hu shel acher gemare berurim yer shem elikim atzmei. But there's no way of understanding that without going through the steps that we're learning now. So this isn't all, God forbid, tangential. This is all part of the process of how you transform a simple, self-interested little child but I don't mean child only in years, but also child in Aveda, early stages to the highest levels of divine experience. So I'm happy to take questions on the summary I just made, but I don't know if you have any questions. But I would like to do now is I did sum up generally. I'll sum up what we learned Friday, and then continue from page 1255. You know.
Maybe you were going more than 10 minutes, but it was so good it felt like 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I'm glad I summed it up. I need it for myself as well. And hopefully everybody, yeah. Okay. With that said, let me sum up now just briefly what we've been learning, which I just did, but I'll just do it more specific. Okay. Al-Pi Kol Hanal, on page 1254, the paragraph Al-Pi Kol Hanal, returns us back to what he left off at the bottom of page 1220. In truth, it really began on 1211. And that is the discussion, what exactly is Gan Eden? We know Gan Eden was created by God. We know Gan Eden, that's where Adam and Chava were placed and told, work this L'Avda L'Shomra. And like he gave the example, the garden you're placed in, your job is to make it grow and harvest even more than it was there in the first place. Like he stated clearly on page 1211. He actually said it with an example. I just want to refer to it because it'll help ground what we're learning. He said the following. I'm reading on page 1211. Like the physical work in a garden. Why? What do you need a gardener for? Why do you need someone working the garden? That the growth, the smicha, the harvest, the produce should be b'tev yeseh, should be even better than it would be on its own. The Aveda is to remove the stones, and to water and irrigate the garden. Which is so the God created a garden. The garden has trees in it. The Torah tells us many trees. It's a full garden. Adam and Chava now are told your role is la'avda l'shamra. What does that mean in Ruchnis? It means that you should work this garden and make it grow better than it would have been on its own. Bring new stuff into it, so to speak. So that's what he says now. But how did I explain that in Chassidus, in language of Chassidus? So he said, Gan Eden, I'm summing up now the second half of page 1254 and the first half of 1255. So he said, Gan Eden itself is the level of Bina. It's higher than the regular worlds. Let's start with that. We're not talking about Avodah now. Just the creation of Gan Eden, just like Eretz Yisrael is higher than all the other, has a superiority to all the other countries of the world, Gan Eden has a superiority over all other areas on earth. Also in Ruchnius, there's the world of Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya. Gan Eden has a special, is Bina. What he explains afterwards, Bina concludes, Keser, Chochmah, and Bina, the Gimel Rishenus. The rest of the worlds, meaning the rest of it, is Zayin Tachtenus. So Zayin Tachtenus is much more functional. Like we said, emotions are already connected to our relationship. Gimel Rishenus give you a taste, gives you an understanding of the source, so to speak, the source code. B'yud nivra elam haba, and elam ha says b'hei nivra. B'yud. So Chochmah creates Bina, and that's Gan Eden. The tainug of Neshamas and Gan Eden is that they're luxuriating in the divine, in understanding the divine, which gives pleasure. Yeah. That's Gan Eden and the worlds. So the worlds is connected to Malchus, to Zah in general, like you said, the Vav, the 6 days of creation, which is Zah, and specifically Malchus. Okay. Now, in the worlds, you also have Moichin, but there it's a Moichin Hashayach Lemidus. In other words, even when you're dealing with emotions, with the subject, with relationships, you also have an intelligence, but the intelligence is secondary. The primary force is emotions. So he says that's the level of Mutva and Murgish. Chitzenius HaMoichin, he's talking even the higher levels. When you get to Morgish, Chitzenius HaMoichin, Bechinas HaMorgish, HaMetzad HaSeichel. The Ikar is Midas, but they're guided by somewhat by the Meichin. But it's called Katnus HaMeichin, Katnus Ima. Then comes the level of Pnimius Bina. This is Muskel. This is now, we're talking Gan Eden. So Gan Eden is already a higher level of appreciation. You're understanding it. There's more cognitive influence as opposed to the other, which is primarily emotions, which is Chitzenius Bina. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Chitzenius and Pnimius Bina. So now we're talking about Pnimius Bina, Muskel, Sha'ikru HaMoichin, and the Moichin b'derech memela, they create an emotion, but you're not focusing on the emotion, you're focusing on the mind. However, one second, what I'm saying. So, however, they're still not sichlin mamish. They don't become mamish seichel. They still are relatable to the midas. That's what he says at the bottom of the page. So they're still generally still in the category of midas, but they're not like midas mamish in the lower level of the olamis where it's chitzenius bina. Okay. So this is godless ima. But ach kol zeh, on the top of the page, he says it's still at the end of the day, moichin shayach lemidas. So it's still bina as it relates to midas to some extent. It's not atzmi bina. And that's why it's still yichud chitzeni of Abba ve'ima in Zoh. Like the aim revetzes ala frechim. Then comes, that's godless ima alone. Ema bonim smecha, right, ima on the children. Now the Havaya in Gan Eden, now the Havaya draws a new level of atzmi bina, where bina is now higher than just comprehension. Bina stands side by side with chachma, and it comes from pnimius hakeser all the way in pnimius atzmus ein sof or ein sof keser malchus shmei atzmi, and this is muskel mamish. The midas have now been transformed to become more than just subjective, immanent entities that are connected to their subjectivity. Even if there's good subjectivity, sichli mamish. Like he said, now we have godless Abba that has made Zoh to be like the level of Abba, Chachma. And what Aveda is necessary? Aveda Mesiras Nefesh, V'ahavta b'chol me'edecha. And the Torah mitzvahs that draws down this level of deep, profound love. And that's why in Gan Eden, love the L'Shabra, that you bring in new energies. Gili Chodesh Mamish, because Gan Eden on its own, even though it's higher than the world, it's still Seder Ishtalshlus. And now this Aveda brings a new energy, which is even more than the dividends that are more than the principle. Gili Chodesh Mamish. Okay. That's where we stopped, middle of page 1255. Now, when you go back to volume 1 that I summed up before, this Chodesh is a big, big topic in the second half of Ayin Beis, volume 1, about how Matan Torah did something even greater than the Ovis. So really, in a way, you could say that the Ovis was still the level within, they cleaned up the pipes and aligned existence to the way it was meant to be in Gan Eden, but not greater than Gan Eden. So in many ways, Matan Torah, even though the Ovis did it through Avodah, but Matan Torah brings in a level that's even higher than Gan Eden on its own. It's almost clear from there. I don't even know, he may have even mentioned Gan Eden back then. That I don't remember right now. So I just wanted to associate those two. Okay. And that's what we're learning now in the Parshas about Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, yeah. Because like we learn in Basi Lagani, Adam and Chava were in Gan Eden, Ika Shechina b'tachtenim, I said, but Chet Eitz Hadas, what did it do? it caused the Shekhinah to go up to Rukiya Ashishi, which means it concealed no more Shekhinah b'tachtenim. And then the sins continued, and the Shekhinah became more and more concealed. And what did Avraham Avinu do? He was the first to bring it back to the sixth Rukiya heaven. And then Yitzchak and Yaakov, till Moshe, the seventh generation, V'shachanti b'seicham, the Mishkan brings it back to the way it was before the sins. So you see, there's bringing it back and aligning it, and then there's bringing the Chodesh, which is what Matan Torah introduced. The truth is the Mishkan, which came after Matan Torah, introduced something even more. But that's the Chodesh that he talks about in the second half of volume 1. Okay. Does anybody want to ask anything? Because I didn't say anything really new that we haven't learned. But still, if somebody wants some clarity, I'm happy to provide it. And if not, I'm going to learn from Ayin Beis on page 1255.
Yes, at that level, third level, Muskal, you're saying that the midas become God-centric, so to speak. They have total bittul at that level already. It's only seichel. The midas have been transformed into seichel.
They become sichlim. So that doesn't mean they become seichel. No, it means they've lost that natural wiring as subjective entities. They are now completely consumed with God. So in other words, seichel, which is objective and allows you to envision things that are beyond your own subjectivity, that's what the midas have now assumed, that capacity. He spoke about it earlier when he spoke about this chachma, what chachma does to the midas. You want to know the pages?
No, but so there's no real transformation yet, or there is a transformation? That's what I'm trying.
I don't know what you mean. Try to explain to me in English. What does midas become sichli mean? Midas are midas. So
from subjective to
I don't want to speak technical. That's why I'm referring to those pages. Yes, that instead of being the way they're wired, let's say a person is a isha chesed by nature. Okay, so the capacity to go outside of their own natural parameters of chesed is created through this level when chachma and the bitl of chachma ultimately impacts the emotions on that level. When we spoke b'chol ma'idecha, that a person's only consumed God is the only thing he cares about. That God is negated to him. Like right now, if you ask any person, most thing negated to you is yourself, your life. God is not so primary as your own being. When the midas come to a point where they feel b'chol meidecha that I cannot live without God for 1 second, and that's all about me, that's the midas have been elevated to that level. So there's stages in that. The moichin helps train the midas to get to that point where a person's personal emotions, first you appreciate God, what he does for you. Then you appreciate God that's beyond you. And then you come to realize, like your mind realizes the beauty and the value of God beyond you, and that too becomes the midas. That's when the midas become sichlim. I highly recommend reading inside where he explains this. It starts at the bottom of page 1229 and goes till 1236. It's like a good 7 pages where the Rebbe Rashab explains how midas go from midas not just being guided by seichel, but becoming sichli, meaning achieving that level of being beyond subjective interest, basically.
I have a question about this inyan of Or Chadash.
One second. Eliezer, you got what I said?
I did. Thank you.
Okay. Because he talks about it, when he talk about, look on page 1234, he says, Bitla Mohus. Let me just say one more thing about this, which I have said, but I want to say it again because it's from Tanya. You can love something because that's good because you have interest in loving it. For example, we love our lives. We need to eat and drink, so we love our food. I don't mean indulging now. I just mean the attachment to it. Now, you can come to a point where you love God naturally. First of all, we have Ava Mesuteres, but even beyond that, you can come to appreciate God because he helps you, he sustains you, he gives you life. So there's a love for God that has our interest in mind, and it's a type of self-interest love, and it's to the right thing. It's not love to something that's anti-God. The thing is, Chassidus wants us to reach levels that are beyond just our natural wiring. So even if you have that natural love, that's why he says in Perek Mem Daled in Tanya that Avas Elam, the contemplation, is what really creates a passionate love. Because at the end of the day, natural love to something you have interest in is very much you, but it's not going to have quite the novelty and the passion of something new. Because at the end of the day, you're getting what you need. You're relating to it because you are wired that way. When you can come to a love, that you come to love something, like in a sense, the passionate love and a romantic love of spouses is going to always be deeper than the love of brothers, sisters, siblings. Even though the sibling love can be more who you are because it's your biological connection with them, same flesh and blood, but it's never going to have that absolute passion. It's very much like mayim, it's like water. It's like a very, passive, but very calm type of love. Whereas a love that comes from something that is new, a stranger that you fall in love with. And again, all we're talking, all in Kedusha here, is a whole different level of passion that really brings your whole person comes alive with it. Now, you obviously want a combination of both, but in Tanya, he talks about Tichila v'rechima tivim and Tichila v'rechima sichlim. The goal ultimately is that seichel, even though it's not emotional, but it can bring you to places that the midas would never go to on their own, because they'll only go to places that they have interest in. The seichel can teach you to have an interest in something you weren't aware of. Like the midas have no reason, for example, to go to Lifnei HaTzimtzum. Why would they go there? They have what they get. They have their relationship. They're getting what they need. The mind can excite a person about something completely beyond and say, oh, wow, there's a new horizon. Like the guy, why'd you climb Mount Everest? Because it was there. You come to realize, so the mind lifts the emotions to new vistas and new horizons. And then the emotions take over and they suddenly become excited about something that initially would have only been there, like a child would have only been cared about my home, my family, my immediate interests. And suddenly you come to discover a whole new dimensions. And that in turn turns into emotions. So the midas becomes sichlim, not that they've lost their passion, that their passion is not about their own small little box. They've gone out of the box, so to speak, and the emotions have become sichlim in their expansiveness. And sichlim also in the sense that they don't get so excited like the superficial excitement that someone gets. It's much more pnimiusdik. So when you see the Rebbe, for example, a Rebbe, when he's doing, when he's dancing Simchas Torah, yes, there's Simcha, but you could see it's an atzmizdika type. It's not like a child just dancing without control or just external emotions. In other words, like the Yom Kippur experience is deeper than the Kailas of Rokim and the noise and the sound and light show of Matan Torah. Not because that isn't a high level, because in a way, Atzmi, as he explains at length, the Atzmizdika connection is actually a deeper emotional experience. It's like the deepest love that doesn't need and can't even be expressed in an external expression. So these are some of the distinctions he makes earlier between midas as a chitzenius, where midas like b'chol meidecha without seichel, and b'chol meidecha on the level where your seichel is involved in it as well. This is a part of what he says earlier, but there's a lot more when you read that there. Okay, just wanted to elaborate a bit more. Fine, go ahead, Yitzchak. You wanted to ask something?
Yeah, I have a question about this inyan of Or Chadash. I can understand how, let's say, Matan Torah would be the introduction of Or Chadash, something that didn't exist in the material world beforehand. But with respect to this idea of having Ava b'chol me'odecha and doing avoida to the point where you're making the midos sichlim and really able to focus on godliness in some way that is not, you're not naturally wired to, let's put it that way. And that's saying that's a gilui or chadash. Now, I can understand how it's a gilui, but the issue of or chadash, you would think it's like a gilui of that which is there, but you don't really realize it's there. In which case, it's not really an or chadash; it's just a gilui of or that you didn't previously appreciate because you were focused elsewhere. So I guess I'm curious to understand what's the nature of this new light, as opposed to revealing something that's just hidden.
That's the difference between Er Chodesh and some. The Er Chodesh means Er Chodesh. I mean, it's like every Rosh Hashanah, it says, the Alter Rebbe writes, a new energy enters that never existed before, completely unprecedented. It's a real Er Chodesh. We're not talking about revealing something that was there already. When you daven and you say Hi Ratzon, you're saying that even if God decreed that a person should, let's say, die, God forbid, you can change that will and create a Ratzon Chodesh. There is the concept of really new things. I mean, there's a bracha that reveals the hidden, and Er Chodesh, whenever you say Er Chodesh, you're talking about something new and unprecedented.
Uh-huh.
Now, it's true, there is a concept that it can be concealed from you, and really it's only Chodesh compared to you, not to compare to someone else.
That's my point.
But that's not what we're discussing here.
Uh-huh.
Basically, it comes down to, if you do something new in your life, if you push yourself a little beyond your own natural boundaries, you will receive in return something that was unprecedented as well.
Got it. Thanks for explaining that.
Okay. So let's continue. Va'inyan hu. So now it's still, the Rebbe Rashab in his very Ayin Beis style is going to elaborate now much more on this topic. So there's going to be more, he's not jumping yet to Einoid or going back to the big theme. He's building this out further. So he says now the inyan in this is, the difference between Gan Eden and Gan Eden after Havaya. So he's going to introduce now another pasuk. This pasuk is from Tehillim. Yizbu, the hineksiv Yizbu Atzei Hashem. Literally means Yizbu from the word V'savata. That the Atzei Hashem, the trees of God, should be sated, should be saturated, should be filled up. So we say V'achalta V'savata. V'achalta means you ate, V'savata means you were filled, sated. So you see there's a level of Atzei Hashem, trees of God, divine trees, and then there's Yizbu, as they're filled up more than what they have on their own. The Isa b'Zoyar, Chaye means Chayesara here, is b'Zoyar Chaye, which is the chapter b'Medrash Hanelam. The Zoyar says on this pasuk in Medrash Hanelam, that's just the Zoyar has different sections, just like the Gemara has Mishnah, Gemara, Braisa, Tosefta, etc. So does the Zoyar has sections called Medrash Hanelam. Daf Kuf Chaf Hey Amar Aleph. That's the place. That's the page 125a. That this Atzei Hashem, what's it referring to? Who are the trees of God, godly divine trees? She'ilone Hagan. These are the trees of the garden, meaning the Garden of Eden. Because of Ramaz, Ramaz is a classic commentary. He's from the students of the Arizal, Rabbi Moshe Zakuto. So the Kosev Ramaz, very often quoted in Chassidus. The Kosher, what is the Zohar coming to say? Because there's a difficulty here. Shekol abrius elu haniskorim bepasha horim ayanim. That why all the other creatures that are mentioned in this pasha, I assume he means the chapter in Tehillim, horim, mountains, mayonim, springs, v'chulu. Lo yachsem lo yizborach. You don't call them like Atzei Hashem. You're saying God's trees. Why don't you say God's mountains? Hore Hashem, mayone Hashem, asve Hashem. I mean, why? In other words, all the creatures, he's not lo yachsem. He's not associating them with God. Ki im elo ha'etzim. Only these trees, only the trees. That's why the Zohar comes to answer that. He says, "Mafarish sheritzene," that his intention is here, "Aliloni Hagan." That is the trees in the garden that he's talking about. He's not just talking about trees, because if it's trees in the world, there are also mountains in the world, and there are other objects and other creations. He calls them Atzei Havaya because they're connected to Havaya because they're trees in the garden specifically. So why they call Taka Atzei Havaya? The answer is, like we learned a bit before, V'nikri Atzei Havaya, the Gan Eden Meir Gili Shem Havaya. Because in Gan Eden radiates Shem Havaya, not just Elokim. Remember, he said Yud, the Yud and the Hey, Yud K, beginning of Havaya. So that's what the beginning of Gilish Shem Havaya. U'kumosh Kosav, like it says in the Pasuk. In Bereshis, you have a lot of times Elikim. Bereshis bar Elikim, Elikim. 26 times it says Elikim. But by Yita Havaya Elikim Gan Eden, that God planted, doesn't say how Elikim, he says Havaya Elikim. He planted a Gan. Shenem Shem Mole. He says the full name, which is Havaya and Elikim. Da'inu Gili Shem Havaya. So we see that in Gan Eden there's a particular revelation that you don't have elsewhere. And therefore the trees in Gan Eden are Atze Havaya. They're not just Atze Eitzim. The truth is, in the beginning, on page 1211, I believe. Yeah, 1211, he says it there also. Where he talks about the beginning of the subject, he says there's the Gan Eden, and it says, Vayita Havaya Elikim Gan Eden Shnem Shem Mole. Sheba Gan Eden Meir El Yen Harbe Yesim Min Ha'er Sheba Elamis. Okay. Just referring to what he said back on page 1211. So now, that's the first statement. So we understand why the Zohar says that has to explain Ilone Hagan. And now he's going to compare this. Like we find this another example for it, the Beis HaMikdash. U'kumoy b'mokem HaMikdash shenemar Achein yesh Havaya b'mokem hazeh. Indeed, Havaya is in this place. When Yaakov fell asleep, is the expression from Yaakov from Vayetze? I think so. Anyway, bottom line is that discovered that this place,
Yaakov,
what does he say?
After the dream. Yaakov had a dream and he woke up and said,
Achen, yeah. Achen, indeed. Yesh Havaya b'mokem hazeh. He used the word Havaya in this place because he realized that this was the Harabayas. So you see that Havaya doesn't radiate, doesn't shine everywhere. But here, Havaya b'mokem hazeh. V'targum onkelos, les dain asar hedyet. That this place, asar hedyet means a plain location. Hedyet refers to like a kohen hedyet is a regular kohen. There's a kohen gadol. So it's like regular. So what's hedyet? Shehen asarim amores shenikroim milim dehedyeta. The asarim amores that God used to create the universe, the existence, asarim amores, they're called milim dehedyeta. It means regular words. What it means, regular words. It's not like, obviously the divine words. God said, Yehi Eir, Yehi Rakia, etc. But milim dehedyeta means they're addressing, the king is talking about mundane matters, the creation of existence. V'heim b'bchina Shem Elikim. That comes from the Shem Elikim. V'yemer Elikim Yehi Eir. Why Elikim, not Havaya? Because obviously it's still created by God, but he's creating basically a mundane world, a world of chayil, a weekday world. Yesheshes Shemei HaMaisa. So that's called milim de'edyota. It's like when the king is not talking about his deepest thoughts and ideas and his deepest philosophies, but he's talking about running the kingdom. So he's giving instructions of how the kingdom should be established. So that's when the king is speaking milim de'edyota, speaking common language. It's another way of putting it. I'm explaining because I don't want it to be assumed we're talking about anything that is negative. It's just common compared to Shabbos. The Eibishter goes back, and now he's going to talk like what's on the Eibishter's mind, not matters of the weekday matters. He's talking about holy matters, Torah, Tefillah, and so on. So he says that's Elikim. Aval b'mokem ha'mikdash, but something on earth itself, even though the world was created by Shem Elikim, mokem ha'mikdash is a special space, a special place God created. It's called the Holy Temple Mount. And it was created from the beginning of creation. It was only later that David purchased it and so on, and later built the Beis HaMikdash Shlomo HaMelech. But the place is Kodesh from the beginning. What does that mean? Because Meir b'china Shem Havaya. In the Mokem HaMikdash radiates a higher level of Elokus, The Shem Havaya. V'yadua. So now, why is he bringing this example? The Beis Hamikdash haya bedugmas haGan Eden. That the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, is similar to Gan Eden. It was similar to Gan Eden. Like it says elsewhere, al posik basi legani. Remember, I mentioned before basi legani. So, what does the Medrash say? Everyone knows this Medrash is brought right in the beginning of the Maimer basi legani Tovshin Yud, that the Rebbe chazed every year after that. She'isa b'Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah on the pasuk says l'gnuni l'mekem shoyi ikri b'tchili. It doesn't say gani, my garden. It says l'gnuni leiksiv el'legani. No. What's the lashon there?
It doesn't say basi legam.
Legani, right? It doesn't say come to the garden. It come to my garden, and gnuni is like my bedroom, actually. In other words, my intimate place. The place where I dwelled in the beginning of it all, before Chet Eitzadas, this was God's resting place. This is where he made his place. In other words, not outside of the garden, in that place. So this Medrash Rabbah is clearly sounds like exactly like the Beis Hamikdash. So you have to ask a question. So why is the Beis Hamikdash Taka not built where Gan Eden was? It's a good question to wonder. Beis Hamikdash is in Yerushalayim. We know Gan Eden is not in Yerushalayim. Gan Eden is somewhere near Nahar Pros and the other three rivers, as we discussed in the last class. But nevertheless, in the level of Ruchnius, Gan Eden is similar to the Beis Hamikdash because that's where the Ikar Shechina was. That's Havaya. Ulechem beBeis Hamikdash. And that's why in the Holy Temple, there's a mitzvah called Riyah, Aliyah L'Regel. There's a mitzvah that says that you should go up 3 times a year to see the holy place. The Kishem Shebal Lires, Kishem Kebal Lires, Kech Bal Lires. Just as you come to be seen, you also come to see. In other words, it's a meeting place where we meet God in a way. That we come to see godliness in the Beis Hamikdash, and just as we come to be seen. So what do you see from this? That it's a special place where Elokus is more begoli. The Kishem shebegan Eden. What does this mean in more Chassidus or more deeper words? That just as in Gan Eden was Sogas Mahus Elokus, just as Gan Eden is the comprehension of the inner personality of godliness, not just the art that God created. Going back to our analogy, my favorite analogy, that the world is the art God created. But what about the artist? So you don't know the mahus of the artist, you know the art he created. That's milided yeta, that's his art. It's beautiful, it's created by God, everything is that, it's fine. But in Gan Eden you have asagas mahus alakus. You have a comprehension in the mahus, in the personality of Getlichkeit. Kamoi Kain, but Beis Hamikdash, hayiriyas hamahus. So what does it mean to come to see? They didn't just come to see the nice architecture of the Beis Hamikdash. They came to see Getlichkeit. There was a Gili Alukuz that they experienced when they were by the Beis Hamikdash. Because what's the point? Coming 3 times a year, it's not a sightseeing tour. They're coming to experience a higher level of Alukuz in the Shalosh Golim. That's Aliyah L'Regel, Lireis, Shemel Kechukuz Churcha. So he says, okay, so this is Gilei Mahuzah. V'hainu, and this means Mipnei Shebemigdash Ubegan Eden, because in the temple and in Gan Eden, who Gili Shem Havaya, is that there is the Gili of Shem Havaya. In the rest of the world, the Shem Elikim, Milidad Yeta. And here is less than Asad Hedjet. This is a special place where you have the Gili of Shem Havaya. V'zeh inyan Atzei Havaya. So this explains why the trees are called, only the trees of Gan Eden are called Atzei Havaya, because these trees had this level of Havaya in them, whereas the rest of the world did not have that Gili. That's the Zoyar on the Posuk as per the explanation of the Ramaz. Very nice. The Isa b'Ramasham, let me stop for a moment. Anybody want to ask anything? Any questions? No? Okay, good. The Isa ben Hamasham.
Gan Eden is same thing like Mahus Elokus. He said the Gan Eden Asagas Mahus Elokus. Kvakem v'samekdash hoya reiyas Mahus. Because we have Mikdash and Gan Eden was Gilui Shem Havaya.
So what are you asking?
Now my question is the Gilui in Gan Eden and the Gilui in Beis Hamikdash the same thing?
Look what the Rebbe Rashab says. He says, Yudua, Beis Hamikdash hayu b'dugmas Gan Eden. What? That's what he says. He doesn't make a distinction here. If you go elsewhere in other Maimarim, whether he distinguishes, maybe. But right now, that's what he says. B'dugmas Gan Eden, he gave an example from the Beis Hamikdash, Gili Havaya, that there's a special power in this space. That's similar, yeah? Okay. The Isa ben Ramasham, and it says in the Ramaz, it's back to the Pirush of the Ramaz on the Zoyar. Who's Zoyar? And this level is the level of Zoyar. Zoyar is Zoyar Ampin. Zoyar means small, but Zoyar Ampin, the small phase, Zoyar Ampin, the level of the Midas. That's called Zoyar. Kabbalah sometimes uses the word Zoyar when it says Zoyar Ampin. This is the level of Zoyar. Hanikra Stam b'Shem Havaya. That is Hanikra Stam, generally called, that's the Shem Havaya. In other words, you break it down in more details, Havaya could be different levels. Havaya could be Teferes. We learned Havaya could be Chochmah. But here it says, Anikra Stam b'Shem Havaya. This is the Ramaz. So with the next thing here is now he's bringing in which level is this in the spheres? Zoh. Remember, Gan Eden on its own without Aveda is what? Yes, it's Bina. Even Primi is Bina, but as it relates to Midas, to Zoh. V'hainu. Now what does this mean? Says the Rebbe Rashab is explaining. V'hainu. The Atzei Havaya who gilib b'china Zoh hanikri eloned dechaya. That these trees of these divine trees or these trees of Havaya is the revelation of the level of Zoh Ampin, which is called Ilona Dechaya. Trees of life, Like you know, the Netzach, like in the Gan Eden there was Eitz Chaim, there's Eitz Das, but he's referring now to the trees of life. They're called Ilona Dechaya. This is the level of Zoh. Like it says in Zoyar, and this Zoyar actually was quoted also earlier. And if you remember where? Top of page 1220. So there's a pasuk that says, in Pasha Shlach, when the Meraglim came back with their report, so there's a pasuk that says the following. And but he's going to explain the Zoyar on this pasuk. Hayesh ba'eitzim ayin, im ayin. Moshe asks them, is there a tree or not in Eretz Yisrael? That's a simple pasuk. What does that mean? Says the Zoyar, that Pirushu, this is the Zoyar's Pirush. Explanation, Im yesh ba'eitz, he was referring to Eretz Yisrael. Does it have a tree, shemekablim milana dechaya, that receives from Zoh, from milana dechaya, the trees that from that level, v'loy masari lo yatir, and not from a higher place, but only from Zoh, oim ayin, or it's receiving from bechinas hakeser. So ayin doesn't mean no tree; it means higher than the level of yesh. So yesh ba'etz is the tree coming from the level of Zoh, or not, and not from a higher place, or is it being mamshech from keser, the level of ayin? That's what he says in Zoyar, which of course gives a whole different interpretation in the pasuk and what Moshe really wanted. So the Meraglim were saying we can't go into this Eretz Yisrael; it's too powerful for us. And Moshe was trying to establish that Eretz Yisrael is getting the chayes from Zoh, or is it getting it from Keser? On page 1220, I just mentioned, he brings it as well, also in regard to Gan Eden. I will tell you that in the Zohar, I believe he connects it with another pasuk. Hayesh alakim b'kirbenu imayin. In Pasha B'Shalach, when the Jews are complaining about the bitter water, so they too say, "Is God b'kirbenu imayin?" And the Zohar connects it to this pasuk. This pasuk connects it to that Zohar, to that pasuk. That they too are saying b'kirbenu means in Zohar, is God within us, imayin, or is it in Keser beyond us? So just as an aside, but going back to the point here, so the Rebbe Rashab explains, ukiyadua, as it's known, in the meaning when it says ki ha'odam eitz hasoda, which by the way the pasuk itself has a different meaning, but it's interpreted ki ha'odam eitz hasoda. The pasuk is more bitmiya, and here ha'odam eitz hasoda, that a person is compared to the tree in the field. So what does it say? The koy al odam ha'elyon. When you saw them odam ki eitz hasoda, odam is odam ha'elyon, the supernal man, which is the odam, the tzira odam sha'al hakisei. So in Yecheskel's vision, the kisei is the throne, and the odam ala kisei is the odam ha'elyon is atzilus. So referring to the level of eitz hasoda, the level of zoh. That level is called eitz hasoda. Odam eitz hasoda, that the odam is compared to the eitz hasoda, which now means soda is Havaya. So he says like this. Like he says in the Maimer B'Yem Hashmini Atzerech, I believe this is in Lekutei Torah. The Maimer is chapter 3. V'hainu, what does this mean? Shamides Zoh, that the emotions Zoh hem b'chinas tzemeach, are the level of tzemeach. In other words, he's now associating Zoh of Atzilus with growth. Because till now, if you talk about, let's say, Zoh, who says it's connected to the tree, Gan Eden? It's all about something growing. We learned that lengthless on page 1220, that it's all about connected to growing, which is going to compare to Midas, because Midas grow. These last 30 pages have all been about growth and development. So Midas are compared to trees. They start as a sapling, right? And then they grow and they blossom into a tree. So he says like this, Zoh is Midas. Now he's using the language of Chassidus. They're the level of Tzemeach. Why? Because they grow from a less mature state to a more mature state. They're not compared. They're not like letters. Letters don't have growth. Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, or anything made up of letters. There's no growth. Letters are etched in stone, so to speak. They are what they are. On the other hand, midas are growth, mashenka and amidas. So the oisiyas shebenefesh, the letters we speak, they don't grow. It's just a matter of how you express them, how you combine them into words, into phrases, into statements. But midas are always growing. They're in a state of growth. That's why they're compared Zoh to the Eitz HaSoda. That's why it says Adam Eitz HaSoda, because Adam is referring to Zoh, the midas. And what is that? The level of Eitz HaSoda, the tree. Which tree is the Eitz Havaya of Gan Eden in Eitz yeah. He didn't go to Gan Eden yet. Let me retract that. He's talking here in general that Zoh is the level of Eitz HaSoda, as the Ramah says. And then that's the Gili Havaya, the Chaya. Yeah. Ukamoi Kain Lamaila, and same thing is above. So this way it is, Akmidas grow here, so Zoh above is called Eitz HaSoda, the tree in the field, the tree of the field, because it's like a tree. Zoh is grows like a tree. Okay. I believe I'm going to I'm going to stop here probably. Yeah, I think it's best to stop here. Because the next piece is going to develop this further. And speak, Eitz is also from the word Eitza. He's going to explain how it's connected to the Ayin, Chachme, Keser. All this is going to come together in the context of what we've been learning, the reaching from Zah to Moichin to Keser. Is it Zah or is it Ayin? As we'll soon see, it's two levels of the growth of Zah in the Pasuk. Hayesh, Ba'etz, Imayin. But I think best to stop right here because it's going to be another layer of discussion. So, any questions or clarity?
Why does the Rebbe only relate Sameach to Midos when we have Mochim de Godless and Mochim de Katnus? We have what we see that there is a levels of growth also in Seichel, not just exclusively Midos.
It's a good question. It's a good question. I need to look into it. I don't want to respond quickly. Going back to page 1220. Yeah, it keeps saying Eitz Hasod is Zod Atzilus. I mean, I have my certain, I have an instinct what the answer to that question, but I want to look it up. My instinctive response would be because Moichin are not really the core definition of a human being. According to Chassidus, the Midas are the real core of a person because that's where you experience things. The Moichin are almost like a gift given to us as they guide the emotions and they guide them. So in other words, it's like the Moichin would be more like the gardeners and the Midas is where it plays itself out. Which we learned that the whole process of the maturity of the mind is meant to help mature the emotions. That's my initial instinct. So Midas is really the central point of trees. Other Mechava are meant to use their Moichin to make these trees grow properly. That's one point. Another point, it could be that though the mind grows, but the mind, even in its even in its early stages, you don't talk about hatva, even though we have different ways of thinking, and we're born with different ways of thinking, but the real personality of a person is different. The hatva, meaning the hard wiring of our personalities, is far more on the emotional level than on the intellectual level. I think on page 1220 and 1221, he may have addressed it a bit. I remember something, I'm trying to look. Yeah, if you look on page 1221, look on line 6. So he says, "Ha'odam b'chlal u'b'chinas hamidus, u'k'may ki ha'odam eitz hasodim." A person in general is the level of midas, and it's the mind that makes the midas. But it's still, I don't know if it's sufficient explanation. He just says it as a matter of fact.
Yes, also, it's much more of a chiddush for me to grow. I mean, it's much harder and much more of a chiddush. That's why it has to be mentioned.
That may also be a factor, that the mind's growth is like natural, doesn't need any, it's not, or midas.
We say that the Malchus is called Hakal Tapuchim Kadishim. This is Eitzim, scoring, the field of Tapuchim Kadishim.
How does that answer the question that Eliezer is asking?
It's not answering the question. It makes the question stronger.
Why? Malchus is one of the midas. The question is why the Moichin is not associated with Smicha and like in Eitz Hasod. Anyway, this is just off the bat responses.
You said that
I'm not saying they're adequate. One second. I'm not saying they're adequate and complete. It just was come to mind as you ask. But it's a good question. It's just something to look into. I shall look into it.
You said that was line 6 on page 1221?
Yeah.
In
A
Havaya,
parenthesis. Va'adam b'chlal u'b'chinas hamidus. Line 6.
I see. Yeah, I see.
in Havaya, we have
One second. Page 1220 and 1221 talk about it. I'll review it. As I said, it's a legitimate question. It's something good to look into. Go ahead, Naftali Voss.
In Havaya, we have the ability to change our midas. Can we change our moichin? Is that our avoidance?
Interesting point as well. You know, sometimes it's easier to change your mind than change your emotions. But I mean, look,
when you change your mind, you change the emotion of the mind.
I listen. Shammai and Hillel, Gvura and Chesed, both their mind and emotions. I feel strongly that there may be some Maimorim that talk about this. Yeah, it's a good discussion. Everybody can weigh in.
We don't expect you to be smarter than you were born, but we expect you to be a better mensch than since you were born.
I don't like that answer because our minds are supposed to expand. Say like what we're doing right now and learning Ayin Beis. It takes us to places that we would never have utba normal seichel unless we learned it and grow. And in fact, it's so critical that it then schleps the mitos to a level that they would never gone to other way. It's like the pathfinder.
Yeah, but remember, my feeling is very strongly. My feeling is that especially Lamaila, midas are meant to constantly develop, and moichin are meant to guide them. So even though technically speaking you're correct, as human beings, the mind expands and grows and so on, new ideas, and you guide to mitzasi, a person can struggle, can harva, and they grow. I think Lamaila, at least Lamaila, the moichin is not so much about growth, but about guidance. That the moichin of Zah help the midas of Zah develop and grow and expand. So it's more like, but the question is still, what does it mean above and also below? Anyway, as I said, it's something good to look into. I shall, and hopefully we'll get to something. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No. So we'll stop here at close to the bottom of page 1255. Five lines from the bottom. Yeah.